Welcome to the VSA Capital Tech and Transitional Energy podcast. And I think those that listen regularly know that Phil, my technology and transitional energy analyst, is on holiday. But I'm delighted to have a very special guest with me today, who is Sam French. And he is the Business Development Director at Johnson Matthey, but specialises in hydrogen. And he also sits on the Hydrogen Council Management Board and I think chairs the UK Hydrogen Advisory work. I'm told that he is the man that knows more about hydrogen than anybody else in the world. So, Sam, welcome.
Hi there, Andrew. Thank you. Maybe not so sure about the last statement, but we'll do what we can to help you.
Well, hydrogen's a subject that a lot of people maybe think they know a lot about, but actually, when you start talking to them, they often don't know as much as they think they do. But I don't know if you've got any more that you'd like to say about your background before we kick off into a chat about hydrogen. I mean, I've given you a very quick introduction. Is there anything else you'd add to that?
Yeah, so I've been working at Johnson Matthey for about 17 years now. Started in much more of a technical role, but more recently been working in business development, focused in the last 4 or 5 years on our strategy around low carbon hydrogen. So Johnson Matthey's a FTSE 100 company based in the UK, about 15,000 people globally. A sustainable technology company. And I think what's key is that we focus on where our capabilities fit best and what our competencies are. And really that's around catalysis, how we utilize precious metals as effectively as possible, how we develop products that work for our customers. So a lot of what I do is work in partnership, building partnerships with key customers. And we often will be providing components into those, into our customers' end products. So we have a number of areas in the hydrogen area that we're focused on. We will undoubtedly have to talk a little bit about the colors of hydrogen.
Yes.
A lot of what I initially did was focused on blue hydrogen. And in that space, Johnson Matthey has a world-leading technology. What we do there, if you want to think about it, is to provide a blueprint. So Johnson Matthey doesn't own and operate hydrogen plants and make hydrogen, but we provide the technology package that would allow an engineering, procurement, construction company to then build that asset for an end user, owner, operator. We've had some really good support in that area from UK government. We were successful in bidding for funding through the hydrogen supply competition, and we're involved in 2 world-leading projects. The most advanced is called HyNet up in the northwest of the UK. That project's just getting to the end of front-end engineering design. So that means we've provided a blueprint for the process, and that's from natural gas in at one end to CO2 and hydrogen out at the other, with multiple unit operations in between that convert natural gas to hydrogen and CO2. And we've worked then with an EPC company, an engineering company, to really define to do the detailed engineering that would allow that project to be built. We're working with a number of companies. SR is the owner operator, and the plant would be on the Stanlow refinery up in the northwest. Progressive Energy is the project developer, and then a company called SNC-Lavalin, or more recently now that area has been bought by a company called Kent, who will do the actual build of that project.
I mean, just picking up on that point, as you say, there's lots of colours. You've mentioned blue and green there. There's grey. I mean, at the moment, it appears also there's a slight gap between what the UK is trying to do and their colour of hydrogen, what Europe's trying to do and their colour of hydrogen. I mean, how do you see the spectrum of colours in hydrogen, and how do you see them in terms of, first of all, one of the word greenness, well, that's rather pointed towards green rather than the other colours, but also the economics of it all?
Absolutely. So To be clear, Johnson Matthey, we have both a green hydrogen business and a blue hydrogen business, as well as supplying catalysts into the existing grey hydrogen market. So we have a very good oversight. Now you can start including other colours. People talk about pink hydrogen when it's uses nuclear as the source of electricity, but again, that would rely on the same technology to actually produce the hydrogen that's currently considered as green hydrogen. What do we think? We think we're going to need all of them, and we're going to need lots of all of them. And really what we should be talking about rather than colors is carbon intensity. So what's the CO2 footprint for these processes? And we should include, when we're doing that, all of the emissions involved, not just at the site of production, but upstream emissions as well. So you're right that the UK, in the recently launched hydrogen strategy that came out mid-August, is following a twin track approach, supporting both blue and green and other sources of hydrogen. And what they're looking at the moment is consulting on the low carbon hydrogen standard. And it will be this standard which allows the different production routes access to government subsidy. What we certainly view is that that bar should be high. We shouldn't be producing hydrogen with high CO2 emissions. We certainly see the existing grey hydrogen business will reduce over time as assets come to the end of life. And these will be replaced by, I think, predominantly blue and green hydrogen, but other colours as well. But we really need that high bar to make sure this is a real net zero technology.
Have we got to a stage though yet where it's economically viable? Because I mean, obviously what a lot of people are talking about at the moment is the big wind farms, basically taking water and splitting it. It's such an easy one equation, isn't it? H2O, and you split out hydrogen and the oxygen. And clearly that's, very green. There's no carbon involved at all. But the cost of that is still really expensive, isn't it?
So that's correct. So that's why we think a twin track approach is the right way, with blue hydrogen being in the near term a lower cost solution than green hydrogen, but that we should be investing in green hydrogen to drive down the price. And the price for green hydrogen will be driven down by expansion in the supply chain. So automated manufacturing, for example, as well as technology advancements. And that's something that Johnson Matthey are concentrating on, both how we scale up production and also how we reduce the cost by through technical advances. Also, I think scale is important, because blue hydrogen, the project I mentioned earlier, HyNet, is of the order of 300 megawatts. So that's probably an order of magnitude larger than the largest green hydrogen project in the world. And we're already in discussions with potential customers around projects that could go up to 1 gigawatt. Now, you also mentioned offshore wind. I think it's really important to understand that in the UK, we have deployed a lot of offshore wind. The earlier deployments were at a high price. The strike price the government negotiated was high compared to electricity that you produce, for example, using natural gas through a turbine. But what we've seen by that deployment and the scale up of that industry, the increase in size of offshore wind turbines, is a real cost down in the unit cost of electricity. We would anticipate seeing similar kind of cost downs in hydrogen, but you have to deploy, you have to start building the industry, the supply chain, to be able to get the reduction in cost that we need to make hydrogen a competitive solution for net zero.
And just finally on the colours, before we move on to some of the things you just brought up there, perhaps. I mean, obviously with blue hydrogen, you're splitting natural gas, that's carbon and hydrogen, into effectively hydrogen, and then you've got CO2 emissions, which obviously with blue you then you basically store it into some sort of carbon capture form. I mean, how advanced are we at the moment in the UK and all globally in order to do that process? And also, just my second question on that is, the natural gas you're going to be coming on, is it all just going to be local natural gas wherever you are in the world, or are we going to end up with this situation where actually you're going to end up importing LNG, and of course that has massive carbon emissions in its own right? I mean, so i.e. how blue is the blue, or is it actually sort of, as you say, a completely different color?
Right. First point around carbon capture and storage. There have been carbon capture and storage facilities operating in Europe, particularly out in the Norwegian continental shelf for well over 20 years. They've captured tens of millions of tons of CO2, monitoring that remains where it is. So that's a well-known technology. It hasn't been established here in the UK. There are well-publicized funding rounds that were cut after a lot of work and money had been put in. But the UK is very well placed for carbon capture and storage, which is another reason that the government is following this twin track approach, either out in the kind of Liverpool Bay area or up in the North Sea, where we can reuse existing infrastructure from the oil and gas industries, as well as skills, people, jobs, and could well be one of the world leaders in carbon capture and storage. So I think it's a bit of a myth that it's not well developed, but it hasn't been as yet deployed here in the UK. But we work with global companies who have a lot of experience in that space.
Yeah, I guess I was thinking the UK in particular there.
Yeah, you're
right. We
right.
are a bit behind the curve.
No, you're right. But we can leverage, some of the large companies working on UK hydrogen projects are those that are involved in these other projects around the globe.
Okay, so where are we going to get the gas from?
Yeah, the second point's really important. Back to the comment around the low carbon hydrogen standards, upstream emissions are critical, but we anticipate a lot of the blue hydrogen produced in the UK, if not most, all of it will come from either existing North Sea UK or in from Norwegian pipelines. Is that the same all around the world? Maybe not, and I think it is critical that if we are making blue hydrogen, for example, in the US from shale gas, that we are working on how you drive those emissions down. And you'll see a lot of the oil and gas companies are very much focused on reducing methane emissions through their systems. We are fortunate here in the UK in that the gas we have is some of the cleanest.
Yeah, I don't disagree with that. And there's an interesting question, of course, if we are going to do a lot of that sort of creation, do we actually, by the way, I'm not asking you to get into this, quite a political subject, is whether we start fracking for gas again as well, because of course, potentially the UK has a huge amount of gas that could be fracked, but is not at all popular at the moment. But anyway, look, I think that's been really useful, just identifying how you see the different colours of the gas. Maybe we could just move on a little bit to, I suppose, one of the big questions that also people are asking about, the whole sort of, politicians stand up and go, we're going to have this hydrogen economy. It's a great giveaway phrase, but where do you actually see the hydrogen economy sitting in the whole transitional energy revolution? Because it won't all be hydrogen. I mean, for instance, my own personal view, but I'm happy if you disagree with me, is that cars will never basically take off in hydrogen. They will go the battery route, whereas trucks and buses and actually potentially aircraft as well could go the hydrogen route. But where do you see the sort of the hydrogen route going? What areas is it most likely to land in?
So it's a very live question, clearly. What we see is that there are sensible areas where you would focus your hydrogen on initially. There are some other areas that there's more work to be done. So to start with, industrial high temperature heating is an area we see hydrogen as the natural replacement for natural gas, and there aren't many other options. And in some extent, the Department of Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy here in the UK have made a call that that's where they'll start. Other segments, such as domestic heating, Whether we go to hydrogen boilers or heat pumps, I think it's a bit more of an open debate. So we need more learning. We need to be able to understand better what the emissions are and what the costs are to consumers. I also don't think this is a one size fits all, and you can have sweeping statements that all heating will be heat pumps, for example. I anticipate we will need multiple solutions to achieve net zero. Also, regional solutions may well fit better for one or the other. So we need to keep options open. The more tools we have to decarbonize, the better. I agree with you as well. If I was looking at buying a small passenger car for standard urban type travel, I would buy a battery electric vehicle. If I had a taxi fleet, I would be much more considering getting a fuel cell vehicle. So it depends on the usage patterns. Then, as you mentioned, heavy duty vehicles I think are a very good fit for hydrogen, as well as things like branch line trains that aren't electrified, that run on diesel today. Maritime, we're seeing more and more interest in the use of potentially not direct hydrogen, but a hydrogen carrier such as ammonia or methanol. And then equally, when we start talking about aviation, really we're talking about sustainable aviation fuels. So it could be a biojet fuel, but you need a lot of hydrogen to make those. So that also drives the hydrogen economy.
But just picking up one point there, actually, because in some ways, some people do get this sort of impression that you can just sort of switch gas to hydrogen, and take certainly residential. Some people sort of say, oh, well, we'll just pump hydrogen down all the pipes instead of natural gas, and it'll all be carry on as it was before, and we're all green. It's not quite as simple as that, is it, though?
So there's work to be done. Absolutely sure. There have been trials that have been performed in domestic settings, blending up to 20% hydrogen by volume. That's only a partial step, but current boilers, burners, cookers can all deal with that level of blending. Hydrogen-ready boilers are in existence today, and would require only a very minimal change to the burner to move from 100% natural gas to 100% hydrogen. The gas distribution network that goes to your house, which is now all got polyethylene piping, is capable of taking 100% hydrogen. The piece that needs a little bit more work, but people are looking at it, are the high pressure transmission system, which is the kind of backbone, as it were, and whether that's suitable currently for 100% hydrogen or it needs some work. But there are a lot of projects by the gas distribution networks. There's a hydrogen house up in Spade Adam, up in the north of England. Up in Gateshead, they're looking at a hydrogen village and a hydrogen road to provide these proof statements, both all the way through from safety, through public consumer acceptance, pricing, as well as dealing with the volumes of gas that would be required and the storage that's needed. So it's not
that point. There's an interesting question, storage. It's certainly something that at VSA Capital on our podcasts we talk about a lot, actually, partially because we discuss energy storage in full stop an awful lot because of batteries and that sort of thing. But hydrogen is not an easy gas to store, and actually you do need specialist storage facilities, don't you? It's not like if you've got one of those sort of a barbecue gas container, you can't really keep hydrogen in one of those. You need specialist containers, don't you?
It is. So in a fuel cell vehicle, you have a carbon fiber tank which contains the compressed hydrogen. So yes, in that area, but it's not a dramatic change from the large scale storage solutions. So people are talking about how you convert natural gas storage. You probably have seen conversations around the rough storage, which can take large volumes of natural gas.
Yeah, but something like rough is huge. That's yes. A whole sort of gas storage cavern. And that's a very different kettle of fish. I'm talking about, suppose, for instance, you need to have gas at what would become, let's call them energy storage stations rather than petrol stations, where you may have your EV chargers and some gas. In those, I mean, the cylinders you're going to keep your gas in, I mean, you could be talking up to sort of 700 bar pressure to store it. And that is a very specialist cylinder, isn't it?
It is more of a specialist cylinder, but in the overall scheme of things, it's not the biggest technical issue. People are also looking at ways of storing hydrogen in different forms, so in chemical bonds, for example. When they're talking about shipping, there are good questions about whether it should be liquefied hydrogen or it should be ammonia or methanol as the route to store. Because you can get higher energy densities, but there are already a large number of hydrogen refueling stations in the world, all of which will have storage solutions allowing that 300 or 700 bar hydrogen to be stored. So technically, not the biggest challenge.
Again, listening to you, there's still quite a lot of, should we call it, challenges to get over. And that does tend to suggest that the hydrogen economy perhaps is not quite as close as maybe some politicians would certainly like it. We're probably talking at least another sort of 5 to 10 years, it sounds, before we're really ramped up. Whereas probably at the moment, the battery energy storage world, which is totally compatible with hydrogen, by the way, but is the other side of it to a certain extent, is probably getting there a little bit quicker. Would that be fair to say?
I think hydrogen's been a little behind, and some of that is because of the fact that it plays into multiple different industries, so it's a bit more complex. But I think what we've seen with the net zero mandates coming out is an absolute requirement for hydrogen to be part of that solution. So what we're certainly talking about is needing to deploy and ramp quickly. I think we'll see the first large-scale blue hydrogen projects up and operational by 2025 in the UK and soon after in other countries. We are seeing more focus now on heavy-duty vehicles and deployment of the infrastructure required for refueling. So I think we're going to see a fast acceleration through the 2030s, through the 2020s to the point that we can get large-scale deployment in the 2030s. Actually, one element that would be interesting to look at is the roadmap for deployment that was in the UK hydrogen strategy, which gave a comprehensive overview across all of the sectors of what needed to be done during the 2020s to allow us really to deploy at scale in the 2030s. So it's going to happen in the next few years. We're going to see the first plants hit the ground. Green hydrogen, the same. We're going to see large-scale facilities coming online soon. But then the ramp-up required after that is, we need to do the learning this decade to position ourselves as best possible going forward. Understanding that this isn't hydrogen or electrification, this is a requirement for both, and that they are both, as you mentioned, very complementary in a drive towards net zero.
Yeah, okay. I mean, they are very complementary. Just again, on a very general point, because we're trying to keep it relatively general. I mean, I think that in the UK, we do have one or two quite successful fuel cell companies. There's been ITM and Ceres that I think are actually world leaders. But would you say the UK is up there as a world leader in hydrogen, or are there other areas of the world that you think actually, they're ahead of us? We need to catch up with them, because actually I think the UK probably isn't doing badly.
So quickly, ITM is an electrolyzer company, and Ceres fuel cells, and Matthey is also invested heavily in fuel cells as well as green and blue hydrogen. We have world-leading technology providers. What our conversation often with government is about, that the UK does have the opportunity to be a world leader. We have some of the key ingredients. We have the technology companies. We have the skills coming out of the oil and gas industry. We have good, clean natural gas. We have the opportunity to do carbon capture and storage. We have low cost renewables in terms of offshore wind. So we have a lot of the ingredients. Now what we need is the strategy, which we've now just seen, to be followed by the business models, which really allow us to create a UK supply chain, both for deployment in the UK and then also for export globally. When we look at what else is happening in the world, historically, California was very much at the forefront, driven through transport, through vehicles and the number of fueling stations, but that dropped back. But we've recently seen under their infrastructure fund that there's a lot more focus back on hydrogen and how that can be deployed in the US. Japan and Korea have consistently been at the forefront of hydrogen with policies, state engagement, as well as large manufacturers of vehicles, for example, and we see them still continuing. China, there has been significant increase in interest around hydrogen and fuel cells in China, again, a lot driven by clean air. Johnson Matthey have recently invested in manufacturing assets for our fuel cell business in China, because we're seeing a lot of activity, particularly in buses and heavy duty vehicles. And the EU, equally, again, you mentioned earlier that there's much more of a focus on green hydrogen in Europe, which is correct. But we're also seeing them looking at kind of continental pipelines, blue hydrogen projects, as well as green hydrogen, and large announcements of funding. But I would say the UK hydrogen strategy that came out this summer is amongst the most detailed and actually has more comprehensive than those headline figures that we've seen from other countries.
Sam, I tell you what, we've been talking now for nearly 30 minutes, and we try and keep this podcast 30 minutes because we don't want to overdo things. But maybe one final sort of question. COP26 is coming up. I think it starts on the 31st of October, isn't it? In Glasgow, obviously. Presumably, you're hoping that hydrogen is right at the sort of the forefront of people's minds at that. And I mean, is there anything that you would say we could hope to see coming out of that that would give the hydrogen economy a big boost?
Well, I think we've had a lot of support from the UK government in terms of hydrogen and carbon capture and storage being firmly in the 10-point plan. The recent drive to get the hydrogen strategy out are positive. In terms of announcements, I think the obvious ones for COP are the first carbon capture and storage projects in the UK that will be funded. Nearly all of those have a hydrogen plant as one of the anchor projects involved. So that will be a clear signal that we're off and running in terms of the large blue hydrogen projects. But I'd also like to really see us focusing in on the opportunity that hydrogen gives across all colours, particularly for jobs and skills and investment in areas of the UK which historically haven't had the level of investment. So up in areas that are very familiar with the kind of process chemical industries or offshore oil and gas, as these will be the real hubs going forward for our hydrogen production.
Well, I hope you're right, because I think, you know, if we can become a world leader in hydrogen, and as you say, we've got all the ingredients in this country, it would be fantastic for everybody, to be honest with you, because it's always good to be a world leader. On that note, though, Sam, you know, I really appreciate you coming on. If people have got questions following up from this, then please direct message VSA Capital, and we'll feed them back into Sam or his colleagues at Johnson Matthey, which, by the way, I think is doing a lot of really interesting things at the moment, not just in hydrogen, but also in your whole battery division. I'm really quite excited by what Johnson Matthey's doing, and I think it is well worth everybody having a revisit what the company is doing. But thank you very much for coming and having a chat. It's been a delight to talk to you, and I hope we can talk again soon.
Thank you.